Historical facts that aren't true. How much do you think you know about history? Perhaps all the things we learned in class weren't always as accurate as we thought. Here are a few facts that the general public has gotten wrong. Move over, Galileo. Most of you may recall that in school, your teachers told you that Galileo Galilei was the first to realize that the Earth most likely revolved around the sun. At the time, many scientists believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe and that all the planets and stars and our own sun orbited around us. That was the belief for thousands of years. While the theory that the Earth revolves around the sun is correct, the idea that Galileo was the first to theorize this isn't true. The first person to propose a solar system was Aristarchus of Samos in the 3rd century BC. Nicholas Copernicus believed this theory to be accurate and made it more popular in the 16th century. However, in the 17th century, Galileo was the first to find evidence to prove it. To be or not to be? Perhaps that isn't the question we should be asking. Instead, we should wonder, did Shakespeare come up with the story of Hamlet all on his own? The answer is no. The idea of a vengeful prince planning revenge on his uncle for the murder of his king father was something that stemmed out of an old Indo-European legend. Scandinavian author Saxo Grammaticus published the story in the life of Amleth around 1200 AD. In that collection, the story was titled Amleth, Prince of Denmark. What do you get when you rearrange the letters A-M-L-E-T-H in Amleth? Hamlet, which Shakespeare didn't write until 1609. Who made peanut butter? Who are you supposed to thank when you open that jar of peanut butter? Your mother for buying it, probably, but who do we thank for coming up with the idea? Your first thought might have been George Washington Carver, but we should stop you there. Carver was responsible for finding hundreds of ways to utilize peanuts, which helped boost the failing economy of the southern region of the United States, but he didn't invent peanut butter. Nope, that credit goes to the Incas, who mashed peanuts into a paste around 950 BC. Alexander the Alright? Alexander the Great was long considered to have had the largest contiguous empire in all of history. Contiguous refers to neighboring territories, which gives you a sense of how much land an empire owns. Well, it's false that Alexander the Great had the largest one. Instead, it was the Mongol Empire under the leadership of Genghis Khan that had the largest contiguous empire ever, owning lands across Asia from Korea and the Middle East all the way to Austria. The story of Lady Godiva. Most of us think of the intricate chocolate treats and boxes you buy for your loved ones for special occasions when we hear Godiva. Some people have heard of the story of Lady Godiva, the one where she rides through the town of Coventry, England, while naked on a horse. She did this so that her husband, the Earl of Mercia, would abolish taxes for the townspeople. Apparently, her husband told her if she rode around naked, he'd do it. So she did, and the taxes were abolished. However, many historians don't believe such a ridiculous thing ever happened. The tale of her gesture didn't even pop up until centuries after she lived. The Real Vikings. Did you know that Vikings never wore helmets with horns on them? We know it's impossible to believe, but it's true. Archaeological research shows no evidence of such headgear ever being worn. Vikings either wore metal helmets without horns or simple leather strappings across their heads. Other than that, some didn't wear anything on their heads at all. The image of Vikings with horns most likely arose after 1786, when Richard Wagner's opera dressed actors in horned helmets. Not the cow's fault. The Great Fire of Chicago burned the Midwestern city for 3 days in 1871. The flames engulfed around 3.3 square miles or 9 square kilometers of Chicago, leaving 100,000 people homeless and claiming the lives of 300 others. How did this fire start? Contrary to popular belief, the fire did not start because a cow kicked over a lantern, setting fire to a barn. That's just an urban legend. As far as investigators could tell, it was a combination of dry weather and an abundance of wooden buildings that helped spread the fire so rapidly, but the real reason it began remains a mystery. How tall was Napoleon? What you may not have realized was that all the illustrations of Napoleon were just caricatures. Was Napoleon short? Technically, yes. By today's standards, Napoleon might be considered short for a male, but he wasn't anything out of the ordinary in terms of height. He only stood at 5 feet and 7 inches. That's below average, but over 300 years ago, people were shorter than average, so Napoleon wasn't even that tiny to begin with. People only thought he was short because when translating his height between the French to the British system, it came out to 5 feet 2 inches instead. The Cherry Tree Incident. To prove how much integrity and honesty George Washington had, people often cite the story of the cherry tree. That story is now infamous, telling the tale of how a young George Washington confessed to chopping down his father's cherry tree. Even with knowing the consequences, he knew he could not lie about it. To say there are holes in this story is an understatement. It's more accurate to say that the story is one big hole because it never happened. It became popular after author Parson Weems made up the story and included it in his biography of Washington. Paul Revere's legacy. People know Paul Revere best for 4 words. The British are coming. Revere supposedly screamed these words for numerous towns in Massachusetts to hear. What happened the night of April 18, 1775? It turns out that Paul Revere never shouted these words and that he wasn't alone on that midnight ride. Revere needed to borrow a horse from a merchant in Charlestown. That night, Revere and 2 other men, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, started the ride that would then garner 40 other men spreading the word of the British arrival. The exact quote came from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in an 1851 poem about Revere. Where are the 3 wise men? Around Christmas time, many of us are reminded of the biblical story of the birth of Jesus. A lot of these stories involve the visitation of 3 wise men who showered the newborn with gifts. However, if you read the scene in the book of Matthew that details Christ's birth, the Nativity, it never explicitly states that there are only 3 wise men that arrived. It just says, "There came wise men from the east to Jerusalem." You might have heard that the name of these wise men were Melchior, Balthazar, and Gaspar, but these names did not appear in Christian literature until 500 years after the birth of Jesus, so who knows if it's true. Vincent Van Goghs Ear. Starry Night, Sunflowers, and Cafe Terrace at Night are among Vincent Van Gogh's most famous works. If you had to choose a group of the next most recognizable pieces of art he made, it would probably be his self-portraits. Later in life, these portraits included a bandaged ear. You probably heard, no pun intended, that Van Gogh sliced off his entire ear. In reality, he only cut off a part of the left lobe. It still sounds strange either way, but we wanted to clear up the details. Einstein's Grades. Hearing that one of the most genius men in the history of the world was a terrible student gives many people hope. If Einstein didn't have good grades, then that means school isn't that important, right? He wasn't that bad of a student. As a child, Einstein was very creative and clearly intelligent, but was prone to tantrums and was antisocial. He often spoke out against teachers, a discipline problem that prompted him to drop out at 15 years old. His teachers all thought Einstein was incredibly smart, but that he had too much pride, which was his academic downfall. So was he bad at school? In a way, yes and no. He was smart enough to pass, but he had a nasty attitude and ended up failing an entrance exam or 2. A Fat Henry. This is the image people have of King Henry VIII. Him in his royal garb, puffy shorts and all, heavy-set and red-haired. He went through 6 wives, leaving the first one for the second, calling one of them ugly, and ordering the execution of 2 of them. He doesn't sound like an ideal partner, and this air of villainy is what many people associate with him. It wasn't always like this, though. Henry Plantagenet ascended the throne at 18 years old. He was athletic and beloved by his subjects. His nickname was once Bluff King Hal. However, with age, he developed health issues that caused him to gain weight. The way he dealt with Anne Boleyn caused people to see him in a different light, as well as the many wives after that. When you combine his health and actions, it makes sense that his public image changed dramatically. No music to the fire. Rome has had its share of unfit and even insane leaders. On that list is Emperor Nero, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The history books describe Nero as a tyrannical leader, one who loved to spend money and live in luxury. The legendary anecdote attached to his name is one of him playing the fiddle while Rome burned. That story was made up later on by historians that hated Nero. Nero was out of town when Rome was being raided and traveled back to the city to help when he heard of the news. The Salem Witch Trials. No one was ever burned at the stake during the Salem Witch Trials, so all that imagery of women being burned in front of the whole town never happened. During these trials, which took place in Salem between 1692 to 1693, those found guilty of witchcraft were taken to be hanged on Gallows Hill. Who found electricity? Some people mistakenly cite Benjamin Franklin as the person who invented electricity. Let's get one thing straight. Electricity always existed. Look at lightning bolts. The truth is that Franklin only experimented with electricity, but its discovery by humans preceded Franklin long ago. It was the Greeks that were the first to discover the electrical charge, sometime around 600 BC. In the following centuries, less than a handful of other scientists mention electricity in their writings, namely William Gilbert and Thomas Brown in the 1600s. 1800s. Franklin's famous experiment with the kite and key happened over a century later in 1752. Before we reveal number 1, we have a question for you. If you could go back in time, what point in history would you live in? Why? Let us know in the comments below. 1. The myths about Christopher Columbus. In the United States, Christopher Columbus is known as the man who discovered the Americas. He sailed across the Atlantic in 1492 bound for India and came to America instead. He also set on the trip to prove that the world was not flat. There are a few things wrong in this story. For one, yes, Columbus was trying to reach Asia, but he did not discover the American continents. Norse voyagers arrived here long ago from Scandinavia and were the first Europeans to reach the Americas. Secondly, Columbus arrived in what is now called the West Indies. He never landed in North America. Thirdly, he did not set out to prove that the world was round. By the 1490s, most people already knew that the Earth was spherical and not flat. So what did Columbus do? That's a whole other video for a different time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. For more videos like this, subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell notification so that you don't miss an upload.